Over to you.
Thank you, Robert, and welcome everyone. Pleasure to be with you and explore really fascinating topic and something that professional spiritual care practitioners probably encounter quite more frequently than the general public would. But it's important to realize how common this is. We're going to explore nearing death awareness, its context, its qualities, and um, and how we can best support people as they're approaching the edge of immortality. It is something I've seen and experienced probably every month for 20 years, working in palliative cancer and intensive care here at Nova Scotia Health. So I'm most excited about this, of course, because of the hope that it brings and how nearing death awareness, when the family witnesses this and begin to speak of it, it can change and support the trajectory of grief to something that really is integrated much more fully. And it brings hope as well as wonder at a time when it feels like life is collapsing. So let me share my slides. I like to call this talk, there we are. I have a slow computer. I do hope this is going to not hinder us too much. There we are. There, you can all see that that slide. I see dead people, nearing death awareness and the terminally ill. You can all see that one?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. So I use photography to help process the experience of being with patients and for them to use as well, especially to document those liminal stages. I'm very grateful. I just want to say thank you to the patients and families that have allowed me to use photography and in their images. As a patient is approaching the end of life, of course, they are moving through preparatory grief. They are preparing to say goodbye to everything, to reality, and to their identity as they have known it. The family and everyone else goes through anticipatory grief, preparing to say goodbye to that one person. So, of course, the scale of the patient's grief is so big that they cannot process it overtly and in a linear fashion. They bumble and negotiate with mortality and move through it in sporadic ways, through contemplation, through grief, through sadness, through tears, through storytelling, through gratitude and sorrow, reflection, and eventually through saying the four most important words, right? Which, as you know, are thank you, I love you, I forgive you and forgive me, and then finally, goodbye. I recall, though, that when the nearing death awareness phenomena begins to happen, in which they are perceiving non-physical or celestial entities, expansive states of consciousness, or very lucid dreams that feel quite unlike other dreams, then there is this curiosity animated about the ultimate. And what a lovely surprise that it comes upon so many. We're going to explore the statistics and frequency of that. But let me start with a personal story. Young patient who was dying, and I was not able to get to this person until they were unconscious for over 2 weeks. Parents at his side and a lot of friends and family gathered in the hallways. This was pre-pandemic. And as I sat with the parents, helping, just listening and tenderly holding that space so their grief could be expressed, we paused and I asked a curious question, which takes some courage. I said, anything interesting happened lately, right? Has Michael said anything? And I said that knowing that he'd been unconscious for 2 weeks. Now the father nodded and he said, well, actually, I was with him 2 nights ago. And he began to say, Uma, Uma, Uma. And he hadn't spoken for 2 weeks. And right, that's the name of his great grandmother. They were very, very close. Wow. His mother's eyes went very wide, and she said, "Why didn't you tell me? Last night I was with him, and he began to say, 'Jennifer, Jennifer.'" Now, Jennifer is the name of his sister who died shortly after she was born, and he was born after hers, right? So he never met Jennifer. But wow, that we all paused and we looked at each other and went, "Wow!" Makes the skin tingle, makes the mind wonder, and makes the heart leap with hope that he had a welcoming party waiting for him, and indeed would be safe upon arrival. I like to say that the task at the end of life is for medicine to make sure that takeoff has as little turbulence as possible. The arrival on the other side is pretty much guaranteed, I think, to be smooth, but we want to make that takeoff just really gentle. And here, the hope, the love, right? The love story, the story of how our consciousness is connected through love, and that even death doesn't change that. In fact, death may be an awakening to it. This was nearing death awareness, him saying the words, the names. That was part of his shifting consciousness to transpersonal states at the end of life. Nearing death awareness is a very common phenomenon that is under an umbrella of spiritually transformative experiences, right? That's an umbrella term. So it can include deathbed phenomena, right? These are different terms for the same thing. Deathbed phenomena, nearing death awareness, and deathbed visions. Spiritually transformative experiences also include near-death experiences, non-local states of consciousness, um, and states of perception that cannot be explained by normal Newtonian physics and ordinary experience. So here are the main qualities of them. And the number one is visions of deceased loved ones, a welcoming party. Uh, that may include pets, and as well as non-human or angelic or celestial entities. It can include perception of spiritual environments, right? Vistas, landscapes, or very simple sounding um, images of trees and grass and nature. Or it could be a room, but the quality, the detail of it is not as important as the quality of it and how it affects the person's consciousness. While that person is conscious and lucid, right, they can begin to speak of a sense of, I have to go. Is my bag packed? It can be quite cryptic. The train is coming. I have to get the bus. Often these cryptic statements are misinterpreted as confusion or delusion, or you know, side effects of medication. But when one listens carefully, you notice that there can be a pattern that emerges: sense of urgency, a sense of knowing the time that they're going to go, or um, a sense of speaking of someone who's already died, and that they're waiting for them. It's very comforting to family and staff when it's accepted for what it appears to be, as fantastic as that seems. When the patient is quite conscious, not deep into the edges of consciousness, then this eliminates the fear of death. They are filled with a sense of peace that's quite perplexing to them. They don't know how to explain it. There's an equanimity and a letting go of all that is, and an opening to the mystery that will come. That's why it's a liminal state of consciousness. It's an in-between stage, and it's wonderful to attend to. Unlike the influences of ketamine and some other narcotics, these are beautiful and peaceful, though they can be somewhat confusing, but they're not distressing. They're not hallucinations. They don't cause a disruption in the person's integrity of identity, right? There's an opening and a connection. And again, this wonder and peace. They're really common. It's really important to emphasize that. This wonderful experience, or this wonderful research paper, found that deathbed visions and dreams, energy surges, right? There's that vitality, the burst of vitality that can come near the end of life. Often occurred. Normalizing and validating them opens up conversations upon them about them and helps facilitate a peaceful death. It's wonderful when palliative care nurses, who usually are the experts in this because they're with the dying so much and they'll see it all the time. It's great to chat about this with them as a spiritual care practitioner, normalizing it, and it can animate and renew their energy, right? It can help alleviate some compassion fatigue and incite a sense of wonder and deeper meaning, right? And purpose in their vocation as nurses. Here's an image that I took. I use a technique using multiple exposures and overexposure in camera processing. I'm trying to capture that state of consciousness as you're transitioning from this realm to whatever awaits. And this woman had her daughter sitting at her side, holding her hand. And we got to talk about, what do you think it's going to be like? What do you think is out there? And she said, as most people do, well, I hope there's something there. I hope God is kind to me. I hope I haven't messed up, right? Here's that need to say, forgive me and I forgive you and thank you. Uh, and we talked a bit about the phenomenon of near-death experiences and nearing death awareness. And it gave her great hope. And she said, well, I hope there's an angel on the other side. And I hope it's my mom, right? That's so common. We name someone whom we have been loved by, because that would help us feel profoundly safe, right? And that anticipation of a reunion. It sounds so cliche, but whereas we're going to see, it's grounded in something quite amazing. So that's her daughter holding her hand, and it seemed to represent for me how the handoff was soon to come. And indeed, she did die peacefully and did reach up to unseen entities near the end of life. Her daughter was there and reported that, and it gave her daughter such peace and joy. Deathbed phenomena and their effect on the team. So here we're of course talking about the docs and the nurses. This is a great study by Peter Fenwick and others. Fenwick is a neurobiologist, a neuroscientist, who was beginning to explore the nature of consciousness, and he came across deathbed awareness and near-death experiences. Led to a deep dive. A very distinguished researcher in England. So he was working at Camden Primary Care, and he found that the patients regularly exhibited deathbed visions and phenomena, but the lack of education caused the staff to usually dismiss it. He did find, and it's no big surprise, that patients would usually talk with their doctor or their nurse instead of with their doctor about it, because of that therapeutic relationship that's very intimate and ongoing with the nurses. This study was of a hospice in India. Wonderful to see that caregivers were interviewed within 2 weeks of the patient's death, and 38% reported the deathbed phenomena, the unusual expansive states of consciousness, and that sense of connection to the unseen realm. There's no determinant. It's universal, not determined by age or gender or occupation, cultural belief, religious belief. This is a universal phenomenon that's actually been reported throughout time. If we go back to one of the ancient or medieval manuscripts, the Ars Moriendi, right, you'll see it's in there, and they give good guidance on how to support a patient as they're moving through those transitional states of consciousness. 6 of these patients knew exactly when they would die. That's pretty amazing. They know the day, and you probably have been with patients who have experienced that. Visions of ancestors or your deceased loved ones, it's the most common, reported globally. So that's wonderful. Dr. Christopher Kerr is a leading North American palliative care doctor. He's at Buffalo Hospice in New York, and he wrote a wonderful book based on his research. And This is a TED Talk. I'm not going to show the TED Talk, but please look it up afterwards, where he talks about what the patients have taught him. So he interviewed them, he would video them, because some were having these dreams and deathbed visions several weeks before they died. And if you go to his website, christopherkerr.com, you'll be able to watch some of those videos, and they're absolutely lovely and reassuring, especially in that the phenomenon makes the fear of death just evaporate. I can think of no greater spiritual gift at the end of life. Dr. Kerr is very balanced in his approach, and he says he's not religious, and he's not talking about his belief in the afterlife. He's simply reporting what he has seen, and what he's seen is quite amazing. In his study, 59 patients reported 276 dreams and visions, right? Some were during sleep, some were multiple during the day. Fenwick's study showed 62%, and that study in 2010 elicited such a response that the newspaper was flooded with stories. And one only has to bring it up over a dinner party, if we still do those things these days, to hear somebody relate an account. It seems everybody knows a relative or a neighbor and can tell a story of this. Really important, again, I want to emphasize, is the positive effect it has upon grief. So this is a wonderfully therapeutic thing to normalize. This patient was aware that she was palliative and going to die. Martha was not afraid, though, because her own mother had deathbed visions as she died, and Martha was there for that, and she had great anticipation of what was to come. But as she shared it, she did so with that quiet voice. This is sacred ground, and people are usually a little concerned that someone else is going to step on it without taking off their shoes, that it's going to be trivialized or minimized or dismissed. And that really is one of the worst things we can do to support the ultimate moment of consciousness and moving into that final deconstruction of the self in order to open up to the transformation to come. That pathway of grief, it can't truly be experienced until the phenomenon occurs. I have sat with family members as they ask, what will it be like, right? The patient is unconscious and the family is deeply grieving. And as I explain the phenomenon, I find it's very important not to use it to minimize or reduce grief, but to engage grief more deeply and to honor the sadness, because grief is the price we pay for love, right? Grief is a noble and healthy expression of a beautiful human soul. So let grief abide with gratitude, let wonder sit there with wondering if life will ever feel the same again. And that helps the family members be deeply present. Right? The quality of their presence is most important. So I'd mentioned spiritually transformative experiences. This is among them. And the Institute of Noetic Sciences was curious, led by Dr. Dean Radin, fantastic researcher. They were wondering, well, do these and other non-ordinary states of consciousness happen to many people? How common are they? So they decided to have a look at the most skeptical people they thought would be in society, which are scientists and engineers, most critical thinkers, right? And they wondered, well, do these people ever experience non-ordinary states of consciousness? And here's the result. The general population, now, I'm curious, you're wondering, is it 5%? Is it 10%? How common is it? General population reported, 94% of them reported they've had non-ordinary states of consciousness or experienced non-ordinary phenomenon. 94%. Enthusiasts, so I would put myself in that category, That shot up to 99.3%, stated that they have experienced some non-local states of consciousness or phenomenon that defy rational, normal explanation. How about the scientists and engineers? Well, it's really high, 93.2. Fantastic. Curious. Well, if it's so common, why don't we talk about it? Because it's weird, because we worry that we'll be criticized, because we don't think anyone else has ever had them. When you work in palliative care, you see that it's quite common. Anne was dying. She was one of our favorite patients. I know we're not supposed to have those, but she was so inspirational in the grace by which she engaged death and dying. And her husband, Harry, was equally a beautiful human being. They would meditate every morning, especially since their son, at 17 years of age, had died tragically in an accident. Uh, that had been many years earlier. And um, I arrived now at the end of Anne's life. I walked in to find that she was indeed not only unconscious, but she had passed. And there was Harry holding her hand. And I was surprised to see Tina, their nurse, who's across, holding her other hand. It was Tina's day off, but she felt compelled, intuition, non-ordinary states of consciousness, to come in and see and support Anne. And there I found them meditating. Harry gestured for me, he said, "Come in." And I stood over his shoulder. And he looked up at me and he said, "I never imagined that the saddest point in my life could also be the most beautiful." He and Anne had been meditating uh, the morning that she had died. And Anne had shared that the night before, their son had appeared to her at the foot of the bed, looking wonderful, youthful, strong, radiating love and compassion. And they communicated consciousness to consciousness with a deep knowing and a full transmission of hope and love. It eliminated any remnants of the fear of death that remained. And she closed her eyes afterwards and just went to sleep, contemplating it. This is an appropriate and common response. There seems to be a shift in our consciousness when we experience these things to a deep quality of reflection. This gave Harry great hope. And as they held hands, she gave her last breath and quietly died. And it's changed the pathway of grief for Harry. This was years ago, and I've spoken with him several times since. The grief does not diminish the loneliness. He misses her deep or profoundly, but it renews hope that she will be in the welcoming party when he approaches his day of transformation. Oh, I pressed the wrong button there. Let's jump past that. So I think the greatest author on this is a hospice worker who was in Florida, and she unfortunately died a couple of years ago. Kathleen Dowley Singh is a Buddhist psychotherapist who worked intensively with the dying, and she is a worthy successor, I would say, to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in that she has become a cartographer of death and laid out an exquisite roadmap using the Buddhist terminology and framework, but drawing very well from the Christian and other faith traditions. In her book, The Grace in Dying, I can think of no better manual for those who support the dying or those approaching death. In a nutshell, here's what she is proposing. When we come into the world, our consciousness has no real differentiation between ourself and our environment. That begins to, as that begins to coalesce and we distinguish self from others, there's a contraction of consciousness that is forming ego identity, a necessary vehicle for the human experience. A second contraction occurs when we realize there's living and non-living things in the environment. So we're beginning object relations here. We're beginning differentiation. And of course, with that comes a stronger identification of self in the environment. So this is formation of ego. Then one realizes you're a mind and a body, right? That you're peering out from behind this apparatus. Of course, in the womb, there's no sense of that. In fact, research, especially from a fellow who wrote a great book, Why We Sleep, seems to indicate that state of consciousness that dominates in the womb is a sleeping state. And then perhaps a dream state follows after that, and a waking state only in the last weeks. Final contraction of consciousness that forms ego identity is that material which can not be integrated is placed into the subconscious. And that's a warehouse that builds up with more and more information. That experiences and information that can be integrated into our ego identity, right, become the framework of our sense of self in the world. Conflict, change, and suffering especially challenge and shape and deconstruct our ego. So let's say we lose a favorite toy as a child. We've lost a central aspect of ourselves. So we grieve until we recover that. Or a new sibling is born and we were challenged by that. Who and what we are continues to morph and change. We get a girlfriend, we lose. We get a job, we lose the job. Our parents die, and then eventually we approach our own death. Richard Rohr also explores this in his book, The Second Half of Life. So as we work with suffering and dying, ego is deconstructed in the reverse order that it was formed, causing that material in the subconscious to come up. It's aching for integration, forgiveness, reconciliation. So that becomes hard homework. Then, of course, a period of despair can come upon a person dying, and that is an essential wilderness to travel in the deconstruction of the ego. Kathleen Singh is emphasizing that suffering and death, she says, are exquisitely calibrated for our deconstruction so that we can awaken to the ground of being, or the fundamental spiritual consciousness from which all reality emanates. So that period of despair is a period of ego self-preservation in the face of its deconstruction. It's incredibly unpleasant to die, to lose your autonomy, your dignity, self-determination, your sense of who and what you are in the world. Your job, no longer. Your role in the family, no longer. Now, life is reduced to the size of the bed and the body. This is difficult. Of course, as one resists it, one increases their suffering. As one accepts and opens to it gently, one experiences grace, which is why she calls it the grace in dying. Finally, at the end, transpersonal states of consciousness are experienced when the ego identity has been sufficiently eroded by suffering, right? No longer separating you from other. Now there's a sense of connection to all. This can start weeks or days or hours before one dies. And it's marked by a profound sense of peace. Not consistent, but certainly different and more robust than ever anticipated. And then at the very end, there can be a moment of ecstasy, wonder, transformation. So if a person has some level of awareness and consciousness, these phenomena can be witnessed. It makes me think of astronomy and cosmology, because this physical form and the story of our life is so convincing. We tend to assume that's all there is. What you see is what you get, is what I've heard so many people say. But that's not what science says. Cosmology tells us that all that you see and touch makes up only 0.004% of the universe. All of the atoms in the universe, which includes the matter beyond the visible spectrum of light, makes up 4% of the universe. 23% of the universe is comprised of something called dark matter, which can only be observed through its effect upon the gravitic power of galactic clusters. And then 70+% of the universe, cosmologists tell us, is dark energy, which works in the math, but we have no instruments to directly measure it. How much more so mysterious is human consciousness? Consciousness is the greatest mystery to science, certainly to medicine. That it continues after the body does not seems spectacular, wishful, until you realize the scale of the universe and our small ability to perceive it. It's also important to remember that we cannot perceive reality directly as it actually is. We can only have it filtered and distorted through the wetware of the brain and the apparatus of sensory organs. The reality experienced by a butterfly, by a whale, vastly different than ours, perceiving sound and infrared or ultraviolet in ways that humans cannot. But their reality is no less real. So it is, I feel, with life and death. Now the wetware comes off, we shed the apparatus and move directly into the experience of consciousness. Yeah, it's an intelligent model of what Kathleen Dowley Singh and ancient traditions have been saying all along. By the way, this is an image I took of myself in Prince Edward Island. I love doing astrophotography. So I was happy with that, trying to capture that sense of wonder. We are part of it all. At no time is that realized so acutely as when we die. Critical is the role of surrender in this enterprise, to no longer exert control, which is an aspect of the ego, in the face of fear and the unknown. I trust that we're wired with the wisdom to come into this world. We must be wired with the wisdom to leave it. And indeed, as we surrender, not a popular word, as we give ourselves to the process of dying, that wisdom emerges organically. And as long as we can give a smooth trip to the patient, no unnecessary pain, then the turbulence subsides and wow, take off. I was especially glad that not only do I get to see this in my patients, but I got to see it in my parents. This is my dad, who would dress as Father Christmas in the little town of Mahone Bay in Nova Scotia every December, and he'd ring the bell and he'd wish good love and cheer to everyone. And when I saw him, even though I'm a man in my 50s, when I saw him like this, I became a 6-year-old boy once again. And when my father died of pancreatic cancer, just, well, a little over a year ago, I think it's coming up on 2, it was early in the pandemic. All of us as family were able to take care of him in his apartment. And he went into the hospital a couple of times for fluid to be drained from his abdomen, but he gave himself gracefully. A naval captain, sea captain, he got his affairs in order to leave ship shape. He gave away his treasury of nautical books. He said thank you and farewell to his friends. And he allowed himself to be supported in the most basic physical ways, as well as tender emotional ways by we, his children. And we camped out for 2 weeks at his home. At the end, he lay in his bed at 4 in the morning. He had not spoken for probably 18 hours. During that time, he did share with me, this was a week before he died. He said he had a remarkable dream in which all the dogs he'd ever owned had come to him, and he felt such love and connection with them. And he was starting to weep as he shared this. He said, do you think it was real? I said, yes, Dad, I do. You know what Will Rogers said? I don't want to go to heaven if there aren't any dogs. And indeed, dogs and animals are reported, pets are reported in deathbed visions. Now, whether that's what they are or what our heart desires, I don't know, not important. The effect is important. I said, they will be among your welcoming party as well as everyone you've ever loved. They're all there. And he just nodded, and that was enough. So 4 in the morning, he hadn't spoken for 18 hours. His best friend is at his side. The rest of everyone camped out, sleeping in the living room, small apartment. I had taken a room in a hotel close by. And at 4 in the morning, he opened his eyes And then, astonishingly, given how his muscles had deteriorated and the swelling in his belly, he lifted himself up with his arms straight up, looking up with joy upon his face, eyes open. And he said, "Yes, yes, come, come, I'm ready. Yes, come." And then he gently lay back down again. Absolutely beautiful. Uh, the family was awakened. They went to his side. I got the call to come to the apartment, and we did so and gathered around. But my brother was here in Halifax, an hour away, and it was going to be 9:30 before he arrived. And we thought, oh my goodness, we all need to be here. But typical part of nearing death phenomena is the patient seems to have a remarkable power, timing their death until everyone who needs to be there is there, or those who they don't want there get away. They seem to be able to orchestrate the timing. Talk about good choreography. So my dad hung on until my brother arrived, and then all of us gathered around his bed. Uh, we held hands, and I placed my hand upon his forehead as the apnea went to 20, 30, 45 seconds. And I said the blessing of Aaron, right? It's one thing to do that for a patient. It's quite another to do that for your father. And I only got halfway through and I broke into tears. I just, and felt the hand of my siblings on my back. And then he gave his last breath, and then he was gone. And we were filled with gratitude. Really admired my family, who brought all their respective skills to bear upon giving him a smooth trip. And for the funeral home, who could not arrive for another 6 hours because of 2 other bodies they had to go pick up. That allowed us to sit and contemplate at his side and see the transformation of the body, the sinking of the skin, the change in the muscle tone, and to reflect upon the gift of this man. During those 6 hours, I recall walking outside, pacing, made a phone call to my wife. And in that choice, I missed something, another mystical event. The rest of the family were sitting in a circle in the living room, having lunch, having pizza. And a massive dragonfly flew in to the room and then made an orbit, pausing in front of each person until it left and went out the door. When I heard everyone go exclaiming and, "Oh, look at that, David, David," they called to me, and I came in and they explained what happened. And even given my experience as a chaplain and that I've written books on this and talked to so many patients, part of me paused and went, really? A dragonfly? That's a bit cliche, Dad. But the size of it was amazing, and its behavior was, to them, undeniable. Nearing death phenomenon and an after death communication and reassurance that I am okay and you guys go on. I really appreciate the research that's done on this. I mentioned Dr. Christopher Kerr. Also have a look at the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm a member of this research organization and helped to gather data. IANDS.org. Now, when you go down this rabbit hole, it gets weird. Because you're getting into after-death communication, and then you're getting into things like psychic phenomenon and mediumship and the whole gamut. And there's strange stuff in there, but there is some robust universal stuff. Here's one of the brochures at their website, Nearing Death Awareness and the Terminally Ill. Really good. They have this video that's available on their website. It's very helpful. These are 3 of the best books I find. Maggie Callahan, this is a classic, and Maggie's a wonderful woman, retired nurse, palliative care. So she's talking about near-death awareness. Kathleen Downey Singh's there, book is there. Dr. Fenwick's brochure, it's a small book. This is free online for download, and it talks about deathbed phenomena. And there's the website for that. So if you want to grab a screen capture, and then you've got that link. Many other books to recommend. Dr. Mary Neal is an orthopedic surgeon in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. She had a near-death experience, drowned in a kayak, pinned under a waterfall. So this book, To Heaven and Back, I really love her approach and her character. So this is a fantastic one to explore. For the more cerebrally minded, Irreducible Mind. This is an 800-page tome, so uh, put a couple of years aside to get through this one. And it's called Towards a Psychology for the 21st Century. So this very much a synopsis of the evidence and research and models of consciousness that support transpersonal states of awareness and moving beyond this realm. Also, this book isn't bad. Um, I'm grateful that it won the Nautilus Silver Award, which is given to books that help support and change transformation of human consciousness. And the people who've won that award, I'm humbled to be in their care. I was so astonished that I received this. So it was just wonderful. And this explores my 4 rounds with cancer and then patients' experiences with cancer, how to best support them with the spiritual dimensions of the disease. And then it goes into the near-death experiences and the hope that awaits. So here we are, quarter 2, that's 45 minutes of me chatting, and I am looking forward to a conversation with you, or at least to field some of your questions. So I'm really glad that I can just give this brief summary. I will also put some resources into the chat, and I'll drop them there while you ask some questions, or Robert, if you could report some. Thanks very much.
Very good. Thank you so much, David. Open it up to questions from participants. Just unmute and ask, or you can put your hand up and we'll try to field questions and comments as they come. Access to the slides. Yes, I imagine, David, you could send me a file of the slides. I can circulate those.
Yes. Okay. I'll do that. And I'm going to drop some documents in the chat so you can download those as well. Would love to have the recording of this for everyone. Yeah, so this is being recorded. And Robert, where will they find the recording?
We have, I can circulate the link by email, but I'll also be posting to our Cask One YouTube page. We have a collection of these talks now up on YouTube, so you can find them all there.
Okay. Are you aware of research among Indigenous communities? So much work. Yes. Oh my goodness. So there you're going to the source because of course, the Indigenous communities have a much more organic, contemporary, robust, and comprehensive sense of connection to all that is. And everyone who reports these does so according to their cognitive and existential framework of identity and reality, right? So it'll be specific to the cultural tradition and the developmental stage and framework of that individual. That only makes sense, right? That also means it's quite specific. I would see my parents when I die. I wouldn't see your parents. But on the top universal stage level, it's all universal. Dr. Gregory Shushin did great research on this, showing that the qualities are universal amongst humanity, but the details become specific as you move through culture, geography, time, level of awareness, education, and then family story. I'm dropping some documents in here, which means I'm not able to read the questions. So Robert, could you read those to me? Or if anyone wants to unmute and just ask.
Yes, I encourage people to unmute and we can have a conversation. Dan is asking, What have you observed about patients who resist surrender, and though they have a faith base, struggle to let go of control and struggle throughout the dying process?
Yes, there's an interesting couple of studies indicating that the stronger, the higher the sense of religiosity amongst the person, within the person, the greater their anxiety about death, and the more likely it is they will try to use medical interventions and treatments that would cause more suffering, right? But they still represent hope. So that's a surprising correlation. Higher death anxiety with higher religious belief. But it's based upon only 2 studies, though. Remember, and I don't know how big the studies were. Still, the phenomenon um, gives a lived experience of beliefs and doctrines that may have to that point remained abstract. So when I'm talking with patients or family members about that, it's putting the rubber on the road, right? It's giving those belief systems traction. I do find there is the higher the religiosity, the greater the concern of judgment from God and evaluation of life. And of course, we all know that's fairly universal, and to work kindly with that, to use some narrative inquiry, some dignity therapy to unpack that is really important. I hope that answers your question. I'm just dropping in anything I've got here. One of them I'm just dropping now is Tibetan Daylogs. So Daylogs are a group of a type of Buddhist nun or monks who are able to move through meditation, transpersonal states of consciousness and have a connection to the underlying spiritual realm. Fascinating paper. So that's in there. That's interesting.
David, perhaps while people are thinking about other questions and comments, just kind of thinking here, curious to know what your experiences are in your clinical setting, the kind of leadership you've brought to this quality of spiritual care and the photography that you do. How do other staff respond? How are you helping to educate them, and what are their responses?
Yes, I several years ago gave a presentation at Grand Rounds on near-death experiences, and was was quite anxious, even though that's within our scope of practice, right? Because we're spiritual care providers. But it went so well. It was the highest attended Grand Rounds they'd ever had, and the highest rated. Uh, Animated conversation, deep curiosity. I find the clinical staff are open to talking about this, and encouraged and fascinated by the research on it, that there's actual research. Dr. Bruce Grayson, oh my goodness, his book, he just put a book out called After. Bruce Grayson, After. Clinical psychiatrist who worked a lot with people who had attempted suicide, and he was coming across near-death experiences. Look at any of his lectures online, any of his interviews. Dr. Bruce Grayson, man of great humility and integrity, and a fantastic scientist and researcher. Bruce Grayson. So I find doctors and nurses and staff are open to this. They do appreciate contemporary language, not a religious language. So we're talking about the mystery of consciousness. We're not talking about does God exist? We're asking what is consciousness? And the evidence, lived evidence, that it's more than meets the eye. I find nurses love chatting about this over lunch, in the lunchroom or at the nursing desk, or if a patient has died, I will ask, were you with the patient? Any interesting phenomena, any nearing death awareness in that person who's near the end of life? When I go to Grand Rounds, I'll bring it up. When it's reported, oh, the patient is seeing other people in the room, right, that aren't physical. So I'll check, is that ketamine? What medications are we giving? I'll say, well, maybe that's nearing death awareness. Wouldn't be surprised if they're gone within 48 hours. And that's the case with the majority of them. So yeah, I would encourage you to be bold and bring it up.
It's wonderful. We have a question in the chat from Mariola, but perhaps first, Leonard, are you raising your hand? Do you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, David. And my background is from the African culture. I was wondering whether you have any encounters or studies on that. From my own experience, one of the things I observed is that we often ignore the dying and what they have to share with us because of our mentality and our association with witchcraft and other things. But instead of listening to the dying and the lessons they want to impact to us before they go, we don't do that.
Yes.
And we are afraid and we turn into the witchcraft and the culture stuff. Have you had any experience or any lessons that you can?
Yes, in what I've been reading of research on that from African cultures, there is this fear that you must keep the spirits at bay, not directly engage with them, right? And it's quite forbidden. There is a sense of the spirit world and its forces that can affect upon you. And here you are approaching the liminal zone, right? And so you don't talk about that, especially if you're not with the spiritual leader, the shaman, right? The guide who would be there to protect the community. So that's quite a distinction that shows up in the research. You're bang on with that. I was with one patient from Ethiopia, and she identified as Christian, but she was very, just going to shut that off. She was very nervous about experience. She hadn't experienced it yet, but she was nervous about the spirit world coming to her as she was going to die. And the only thing we could do, of course, was embody compassionate presence, listen to her, help her express those fears. I did, in the end, share a bit of the research on near-death experiences and how, or near-death awareness, and how your ancestors, your loved ones, often are there to greet you. So this also ties into transpersonal psychotherapy and the experience of research on psilocybin, that when you're encountering a scary or disturbing aspect of a spiritual phenomena during an experience using psilocybin or during a close to death, one of the best things you can do is turn towards it, not away, with kindness and compassion. And then the distressing event changes and is transformed. This ties in to distressing near-death experiences, which are reported. This book, The Buddha in Hell and Other Alarms. This is by Nancy Evans Bush. Distressing near-death experiences in perspective. People do have upsetting, or we might call them hellish, but that word just, it doesn't qualify. There are distressing near-death experiences that are very upsetting. And it's found with every one of them. When the individual turns towards the frightening apparition with compassion and curiosity, or they call out for help, then it's transformed into a positive near-death experience. And there are various theories. Stanislav Grof and others have thought this is a projection of your own existential pain that becomes the environment in which your consciousness is now dwelling or moving towards. Very complicated stuff. But even distressing near-death experiences become transformative ones that enrich a person's life when they move towards it with compassion. But that's scary. That's difficult to do when terror has swallowed you. So this is part of a spectrum. I think the afterlife is more complicated than we could ever imagine. So the best advice is just love as best you can here and now. Be kind and good and compassionate. And hopefully that'll get us a smooth trip.
That's true. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. David Mariola is asking about which sense is the last to leave? What are you aware of in your working with patients who are dying, and what might you say to family members who are with them?
I would say that hearing, of course, is the last sense, but I think it's more complex than that, because those who have a near-death experience, now I didn't have this during my near-death experience. That was 30 years ago. A lot of people have an out-of-body experience where they see themselves. It's always from above, right? It's not from the side, which is induced by hypoxia and some medications, but it's from above. And they can perceive what the living are saying and feeling, right? But dominated by a compassionate detachment. So even after the person has died, I encourage the family members not to run away. Stay for longer than 30 minutes, maybe longer than an hour if you can. And send that person their spirit, send them your love, let them hear your stories, talk about them as if they're in the room, still present, with respect and gratitude. So I think there is a perception that may be quite brief, but it is beyond hearing. I hope that makes sense. Dr. Kenneth Ring did a great study several years ago on people who were congenitally blind since birth, and they'd had a near-death experience during which they could see their environment, their body, they could identify the colors accurately, right? So they'd come close to death and then returned and been revived. This happens to 1 in 10 people who have come close to death, 1 in 5 who have a cardiac episode. So if you're working in the cardiac wing, please check on anything interesting happened. So these people were reporting what they saw, but they were blind. Well, the visual cortex was still functioning. The information just needs to be processed. And when they were dead, they didn't have to rely upon the software or the hardware, the eyes. The information could go directly through consciousness. Fascinating stuff.
Very interesting indeed. We have a couple minutes left with you. Any final questions or comments? Now's your chance.
Yes, I'm surprised by how clergy are not well briefed in this. Chaplains are better because we tend to get exposed to it. So I would encourage you to do some digging. Have a look at that. I must find, I have a resource sheet that I put together. Oh my goodness, I hope I can find it. Yes. There it is. So this is David Maginley Resources. This is 7 pages of links to interviews, research papers, videos. Here is the Grayson near-death experience scale. If you have talked with someone and they had a near-death experience, temporarily transformed to a different realm, and they don't know how to integrate that or speak of it, this scale is a great standardized assessment tool. I've given you essentials for chaplains. Here's a great one on consciousness in the brain. So get familiar with the topic, because we're all going to find out one day, aren't we? I think this should be bread and butter of our profession. We should be very familiar with it, normalize it, as extraordinary as the phenomenon is, and realize that no one's got a copyright on this. If consciousness continues after the body stops, it must be a universal thing. I've concluded that one's spirituality is determined much more by their love than it is by the content of their belief system. So when you focus on your love, you can't do any wiser than that.
Wonderful words to end with. Thank you so much for your presentation today, David, and you've increased my reading list. Dozens of interesting looking books that I really want to read now. So thank you for everything today, and thank you everyone online for participating. Again, this has been recorded and will be posted in the next day or so to our YouTube channel, so you can look forward to that. And again, thanks very much, David, and we'll see you all next time. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.